Right, I think we can begin then. Hi everyone. I'm Akshay. I'm a senior at the Harker School and a treasurer of the Philosophy Club. So today I'll be talking about the philosophy present in the game Among Us. So you might be wondering what we're going to cover. We'll go over different elements of the Among Us game and the different philosophical questions they end up raising. And ultimately, I'll use Among Us as kind of an example to introduce a lot of fundamental philosophical viewpoints, and we'll try to make it fun along the way. So if you're not familiar with the actual game Among Us, I guess to sum it up quickly, you can either be a crewmate or an imposter. You're stuck on a spaceship, and there can be up to 10 people in total, and up to 2 of them might be imposters. And so the goal of the crewmates is to finish all of their tasks or to root out who the imposters are. If you're an imposter, then you can try and do fake tasks, try to sabotage the entire system, so turning off the lights, turning off the oxygen present, and then you can kill people. After killing happens, or just in general, someone can call an emergency meeting or report that a death has occurred. And then everyone gathers in the cafeteria, or at least if you're playing on the Skeld in the cafeteria, and you vote on who to kill. You can also choose to skip a vote. And so if you're familiar with the game Mafia, it's kind of like that. It was released a couple of years ago, but it's gotten really popular. There have been hundreds of millions of downloads, and I really recommend it as a game. It's really fun. So of this game, I would say there are kind of three main, we can divide into 3 main parts. There's just like doing tasks, like repairing wires and stuff. There's like the imposters killing people, and then there's voting on who to kill or not. I would say that the first 2 aren't very interesting. Most philosophers agree killing is usually bad, and I'm not sure there's really an ethical standpoint on fixing wires. We'll get to the exceptions to killing being bad in a moment, but I think this talk is really going to focus on the voting procedure because there's a lot of applicable philosophy there. So in terms of the voting procedure and the moving parts present, first, when the vote comes up, you have to gather all the information about where everyone was. And so that means you have to talk to each other using chat. And what that does is it opens the door up for lying. And so we'll talk about lying and use it as a case scenario to kind of introduce a lot of fundamental philosophical ideas. And then secondly, you have to vote based on that information. And in Among Us, voting on that information means you're going to have to choose who to eject into space. And so that brings up a lot of questions about punishment, about deterrence and rehabilitation, and we'll get into those. So breaking this down, we'll start with the element of lying. You may think this is super straightforward. I mean, there's a whole commandment that thou shalt not lie and everything, but it's not as clear-cut as you may think. So there are 3 main branches of philosophy. Kind of in general. There's deontology, which is about conforming to duties. There's virtue ethics, about how we can emulate virtuous character. And there's teleology, about how the consequences of an action are all that matters. It's also known as consequentialism. Those are kind of the philosophy words, but I'll try and minimize the use of jargon from here on out. So what do each of these 3 philosophies have to do with lying, and the lying that will take place in the typical game of Among Us? So we'll start with deontology. This is Immanuel Kant. He's a super well-known philosopher. He kind of looks like an angsty teenager here. If you're not a fan of him, you don't have to look at his mug for too long. But basically, Kant was a deontologist. There's a whole branch of ethics that's just named after him. It's called Kantian ethics. And so Kant thinks that lying kind of sucks. He actually has this test. It's called the categorical imperative to determine whether or not something is moral. It's kind of complicated, but the short of it is that you do things that are universalizable. So if it makes sense for everyone to do it. And so part of that is treating people as what he calls ends in themselves. So an example would be not killing people, because if you kill someone to open up a position for you, like becoming king or something, even if it really rocks to be king, it's not right to kill someone to get to that position, since you'd be treating them as means to the end of achieving your goal of becoming king. So treating people as means to an end is not justified. Lying is kind of the same way. You can't really imagine a world in which everyone just lies, and especially because it would require treating other people as means to an end, because you'd have to deceive them to get what you want. So in Among Us, Kant would say that everyone should tell the truth, including the imposters, or you're being unethical. Now, that doesn't really make for a super fun game, but it's kind of worth mentioning just as different as one of the philosophical viewpoints. So Kant basically thinks lying is pretty much always wrong. What about the others? Next, we have Jeremy Bentham. He's also very well known. Kind of looks like Ben Franklin, honestly. So Bentham founded utilitarianism, which is a type of consequentialism. And remember, consequentialism are philosophies that only care about the consequences of our action. So utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. You look at how an action would affect everyone, and you see if it leaves society better or not. So that doesn't really mean that lying could be intrinsically bad or good. It's actually pretty contingent. If your friend asks you if, their cooking tastes good, but it's actually like complete garbage, you might tell them a white lie to make them feel better and say it's actually good cooking. Bentham would think that that's fine because the net consequences would probably be good. Your friend feels nice, and maybe you have to suffer through the cooking, but it's not that big of a deal. Kant, on the other hand, would probably say that you should stick to the facts. So with util, lying can be fine if it results in good consequences. So for utilitarianism, if lying about being the imposter really leaves everyone better in the long run, then you should lie. You might say that lying lets people get killed in the game, which isn't a good consequence, but I think that lying ultimately enables the game to be way more fun than if you couldn't lie. So util would ultimately say that lying in Among Us is morally justified. Finally, we have Aristotle. If you're familiar with philosophy, then he might be the first person you think of. I think his statue looks better than some of these other paintings. Aristotle really pioneered virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is basically thinking about what makes certain things virtuous or not. Aristotle thought that we should try to emulate certain virtues and the actions of virtuous people. And he also thought that the optimal position, if you're stuck between two extremes, would be what he called the golden mean. And so virtue ethics' position on lying is that it's not really virtuous to lie, but there's not an absolute prohibition on lying either. Like being nice could be a virtue. And in the example about lying about your friend's cooking, it could be virtuous to actually be nice to them about their cooking. So it's not as clear cut as deontology. It's sort of in the middle between utilitarianism and deontology. So with regards to lying, the first part of the vote emergency meaning experience, there are these three different philosophical viewpoints. Now we'll talk about the more fun part, I think, for a lot of people, which is voting on who to eject. So if you think of Among Us, you take away the game aspects a little, and you think of Among Us as a court, then the players are the jury, and really the only penalty that's possible is the death penalty. And so if you think about it in this analogy, then there are actually a lot of philosophers who have thought about criminal justice and sort of the philosophical implications of punishment. So here we're going to examine what the role of punishment is. And you may think that punishment is one thing, like maybe it's deterring people from committing more crimes, or maybe it's giving a criminal their just desserts. But there are actually a lot of different explanations that all kind of make sense. So first, there's just the simple idea of deterrence. The idea that, if people do bad things, but we punish them for doing those bad things, they're going to do those bad things less. Ultimately, harsh punishment makes you feel bad, and so it'll stop you from committing more crimes. This would be the position that ejecting people from the ship in Among Us would deter imposters from killing people, or at least wait later into the game to do so, since they could be found out. If you remember Bentham a few slides ago, his big insight was applying utilitarianism to criminal law. He said that if you made committing a crime as painful as possible, then no one would actually commit a crime. That really focuses on the deterrence role of punishment, and it's also completely contingent. Whether or not we should do a particular crime varies from circumstance to circumstance. So maybe a murder in one case merits 20 years, but in another case, it's only 5 years. So that's a little different from how law actually gets implemented, but it's reflected by things like discretion. Second is retribution. This is the idea that just because someone did something bad, they ought to experience something bad. Note that it could be the case that, you punish someone and they don't get deterred at all from doing that crime. That doesn't matter. The mere fact that we punish them is a reason to punish them. Just because they did something bad, they ought to experience something worse, like the death penalty or something. So in Among Us, it'd be that, the imposter killed one of your crewmates or maybe one of your friends, and you want to eject them in revenge. So it's important to note that that the consequences of the actual crime does not matter. All that matters is that they committed a crime, and the punishment doesn't actually have to be proportional here. Finally, there's the argument about social norms. It's that punishment really communicates that society doesn't really like a particular crime being committed. So they use punishment to indicate their displeasure. So, the crewmates don't approve of the imposter killing everyone on the skeld. And so, we eject people for doing that. This also takes the interesting position that a crime isn't against one person. Like, if you rob me, you committed a crime against me, but these philosophers would also say you committed an offense against society writ large. And so, because you committed a crime against society writ large, society gets to exhibit their displeasure with you, and that takes the role of punishing you. And so I think to a lot of people, all of these seem somewhat intuitive as a combination of punishments, or as a combination of explanations for punishment. And there are different philosophers that have actually combined them in terms of trying to explain why punishment may seem morally necessary. However, there are also people who just say that punishment is completely unjust. Kind of the idea that two wrongs don't really make a right. In kind of contemporary politics, I would say these are some of the people who think that we should abolish prisons or abolish the police. And they often view crime not as this really big legal infraction, but just as like an interpersonal conflict. Like, you did something wrong to me, and so we got to like work it out. And so this brings up the idea of like restorative justice, that you can try and rehabilitate people who maybe have committed crimes because of like poor social circumstances rather than something else. In Among Us, this would be like talking it out with the imposter. I'm not exactly sure if that would work, but it's worth mentioning. So that's punishment. There are a lot of different ways to view punishment in the game, and they really reflect a lot of long-standing and deep debates about what punishment should look like in our society writ large. And so finally, we're going to talk about kind of game theoretic aspects of the game, and this will kind of shape how you approach playing the game in your own time. So some people like to think of game theory as a subset of math or economics, but really it deals with how rational people will approach a situation strategically. And that's pretty important for morality as well, because different moral dilemmas can change based on how people will approach responding to them. And so ultimately, to set this up in game theory terms, you have a problem. And it's a problem of what's called asymmetric information. It's the idea that there are some people who know if they're an imposter or not. Not everyone knows if you're an imposter. And so there are some people who know more than others. And what we need to figure out is how everyone can figure out who is an imposter and who is not. And the way this takes place is by using things called signaling devices and screening devices. A signaling device is basically telling everyone, here is a really clear way that I can show you that I am actually a crewmate. You have to signal to everyone that you're a crewmate. And so in Among Us, a really good example is completing visible tasks. So in Medbay, you can complete scans if it's one of your tasks, and that can visually show to everyone that you are a crewmate, because only crewmates can have those types of scans. It's like the green scans in the kind of bottom right corner. And so that's a really good signaling device, because if someone sees you doing those, then they know that they're a crewmate. And so it can be really advantageous to point out to people, hey, I'm completing this task. And so you can make sure that no one tries to like eject you because they think you're an imposter. The converse of that is screening devices. And screening devices are where you're trying to figure out, okay, I'm trying to figure out who's an imposter and who's not an imposter. And so I'm going to ask a really particular question or require them to do a really particular task. And that's going to show to me whether or not they're actually an imposter. So an example just during the votes would be figuring out your whereabouts during the murder. You figure out who has an alibi and who doesn't. And based on if everyone's alibis match up, you can kind of see who's trustworthy. This is an ultimately imperfect screening device, because talk is ultimately cheap. So to really signal, you got to do something that's really costly or ultimately impossible for an imposter to do. Because, the imposter could just say, hey, I was in like electrical, or I was in like storage. And maybe no one was there to confirm or deny. And so you gotta take more costly and more difficult actions in order to really show and really commit to the fact that you're not an imposter. Because the imposter could always say, I'm not the imposter. It's not really a good screening device. And also, it has to leave some uncertainty. So the perfect signaling device is to like send a screenshot in like Discord showing that you're a crewmate, but that kind of ruins the fun of the game. So keeping it reasonable, you want to have some reliable way of showing that you're actually not the imposter. So I think one of the best ways to do so is to actually publicly commit to to being executed or really to trading your life if you're confident that you're like accusing someone else of being the imposter. Because in order to make something credible, you really have to signal that you're really willing to take a really high cost. You're really willing to take a high punishment if you're wrong. If you're only willing to say that you're a crewmate, but you're not willing to do anything really really bad if it turns out that you're not a crewmate, then you can't really be trusted. But if you're willing to say, okay, I'm a crewmate, and if what I say doesn't pan out, then you can just take me out of the game, then I think it's way more compelling to other people that you probably actually are a crewmate, because you wouldn't just like willy-nilly say like, take me out of the game. And so when you do something like, let's say you stumbled in on the imposter, and you stumbled on them killing someone and you report, they can just say, oh, you're the imposter. And so the clear way to adjudicate this is to say, I am willing for you to like take me out of the game if it turns out that person isn't the imposter. Just eliminate them first. And that kind of makes it really unstrategic for imposters to try and say, to try and counter accuse and stuff like that. And so that signals confidence in your choice ultimately. And it's just something that it is not rational for the imposter to do, because, if they try and counter accuse you and say that you're the imposter, like, sure, maybe you lose the first round, but then the round after that, they can get taken out because it's clear that they're actually the imposter. And so ultimately, this helps signal credibility. And, if you really want to establish credibility, you have to do more than just saying, I'm the imposter, you can kill me if I'm not. Or I'm not the imposter, you can kill me if you're not. Doing things like tasks publicly and showing how, your tasks raise the task meter, or outing an imposter can all confirm that, confirm credibly that you're a crewmate. You might be asking, what's the response to the imposter? Ultimately, all of this relies on the free flow of information, and the response of the imposter should be to just disrupt all of that information as much as possible. And so one of the ways you would do this is to just clog chat with a ton of nonsense. So you want to really just have people like spouting nonsense about like what may be more strategic or not, or not strategic, but what they were doing at the time of the murder. So like maybe you ask like where everyone was, or where the murder was, and then where everyone was during the murder, and then ask them like what tasks they were completing and who they saw during those tasks and how long those tasks took to complete. And you only have so long to actually vote on like who is the imposter or not. And so if you really just like spam chat with all of this like nonsense, then no one's really going to be able to figure out anything useful. And then people might vote randomly, people might skip the vote, and you've lived another round. And so this can really help with running down the clock ultimately. And so there's kind of like a nuclear option here that you can do to try and additionally ensure your credibility. It's a little specific. So let's say you're in a 2 imposter game and you're the imposter, and you're confident that if you ratted out your partner, they wouldn't rat you out in return. Like they wouldn't get like really salty. You could rat out your partner as a way to signal your credibility. So, if you're sure that they wouldn't counter rat you out, or like maybe, you're playing with friends and you're talking with your friend about strategy, one of you could basically reveal the other. Say you like witnessed a murder happening, or like maybe go in a group, or you could say you like saw them going through vents or something. That would probably make it seem like you're a crewmate. You wouldn't want to do this like early. You wouldn't want to like start the game and say this person's an imposter, because there's like no justification there. But you can be reasonably sure that you can do stuff like control the flow of information and make like controlled choices and strategic risks in order to really make it seem to really gain the trust of everyone else. Because that's like ratting out an imposter is the ultimate credibility device, right? It to others, unless you've like really coordinated it, it really seems like you are a crewmate if you bring an imposter to justice. And so that is a really good way of getting people's credibility. And then you can use your newfound credibility to turn it onto other people. You could say, this person's sus, their alibi doesn't match X, Y, and Z. Or maybe you're with that person and you just don't confirm their alibi. You could just lie about their whereabouts. And if you're confirmed to be credible, then it can really help you sow mistrust throughout the ranks and help you achieve a win. So kind of to sum up this section, it's really hard to establish universal rules in a game like Among Us, where the situation can change so drastically. It's really just important to remember this framework, that if you're a crewmate, you want to really appear credible, because if you appear credible, then it's way easier to figure out who's an imposter and who's not, and you won't get like ejected out. The converse is, if you're an imposter, then you really want to tear down the credibility of other people, right? You want to make it seem like you can't trust who is who. If someone tries to seem credible, you want to tear down their alibi, or really question their alibi or their whereabouts. And that can kind of like muddle the debate enough that people aren't sure who to vote, or they vote for the wrong person, and ultimately you end out on top. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. Here are my citations. Lying is unethical according to Kant, so I won't say I made these. That is pretty much the presentation as of now. I haven't really been looking at like chat and everything, but I think people can message everyone. So if anyone has like a question, feel free to send it out in chat, and I can like answer them one at a time.
Akshay, I have to change that back. Hold on.
Okay, I'm not sure if everyone can chat or not. I only have the co-host things. Okay, yeah, there's a question. So by Ansh. So how does deontology, virtue ethics, and util factor into evaluating who to eject from the spaceship? Would it be immoral to vote out? Yeah, so I think this brings up some really interesting ideas about like the role of innocent people in criminal justice. Um, you mentioned those three different frameworks. I think like so with Bentham, for example, for utilitarianism, they wouldn't really care about necessarily sentencing an innocent person, as long as rooting out an innocent person would make sure that we can ultimately find out who the imposter is. So if you just think about it mathematically, in like a 10-person game where there are like 8 crewmates and 2 imposters, if you execute someone and they're a crewmate, then you've only lost like 12% of your team. But if you root out an imposter, they lose 50% of their team. So quantitatively, it seems like all else equal, it would make sense to remove people, just because there's a greater chance that it harms others than yourself. And so unless there's just like strong evidence to the contrary that like they're probably innocent, like util would probably say like you should probably just vote them out. Also, utilitarianism tends to align strongly with game theory because they both have roots in economics, and game theory would also support like kind of weeding people out. Deontology, I think, has a much stronger prohibition about like innocent people like being voted out, and so kind of like with regards to that, it also depends on what type of deontology you're thinking about, but they would probably say that there should be an overwhelming amount of evidence that the person is guilty before making them innocent, because the point of punishment is to punish guilty people, and there's kind of like a moral duty or a moral rule to not punish the innocent. Virtue ethics probably lies somewhere in the middle. I think just in terms of like, is it virtuous to kind of vote out like innocent people? Probably not. But I think in these kind of like probabilistic scenarios where you're not sure about who is and who isn't, like people would probably say like, I don't think virtue ethics takes like a strong stance either way, probably towards like erring without like voting to like execute an innocent person. But deontology just has like a far stronger condemnation about that. And so deontology, like probably you would like skip your vote. So like if you just think like red is sus, but you have like that's just your like gut feeling, deontology would probably say like hold off on that. Uh, should you ever just skip your vote even if it mathematically makes sense to try and vote someone out? Like that's a good question. I wouldn't just say like willy-nilly like vote someone just because like mathematically it works out. You should try and have some evidence behind it, because if you're just like voting them out, then like the chance that you vote out a crewmate is also higher than not. Ultimately, the math still works out that you should like vote out an imposter, but it's not as close. Um, and so you want to have some evidence behind that. It's like, yeah, like skip your vote if they're like, uh, you shouldn't just like vote randomly, if that makes sense. Okay, there's a question about the rules about don't vote on 7 and don't vote on 4. So uh, don't vote on 7 probably applies situationally. Like if you're with a bunch of like experienced people, they might like I think don't vote on. So for people who aren't familiar, don't vote on 7 is the idea that if there's 7 people left and you vote someone out, then there are 6 people left, and so that allows both the remaining imposters to just like kill one person each, and that will leave 4 and 4, and then or just like 4 people left, in which case the imposters would automatically win. Um, I'm not sure if there's like like an ethical. I don't think ethics really cares about like who is left. Like maybe utilitarianism cares a little and would probably say like you shouldn't vote on 7 just because it makes it more likely that the imposters would win. But the other two frameworks really wouldn't care that much about it. Um, like don't vote on 4 is kind of a similar logic. Miss Main, you said you had a question.
Yes. So, as you describe these different ways of approaching like these kinds of decision making things, now this is in a game, obviously, and you referred to game theory and how that's often used in the context of economics, which sort of like can move away from ethical decisions at times, right? Because it's always, well, not always, but it's often about like gain, whether that's ethically, moral or not, right? So, have you read anything about like gamer personalities and how people approach games and things like that? We do a little bit with this in my class. I'm wondering if, I guess my question is, do you think that if people get in the practice of lying in a game and being deceitful in a game, that it can ever carry over into their real life interactions? Or do you think that in general people do a good job of separating those behaviors from a gaming setting and a real life setting in person?
I think I'd have to. Well, I haven't read any like psychology literature, for example, on how people like approach games or lying. There's pretty good evidence that humans are just kind of terrible liars. So I think even if you tried to lie, in real life, it wouldn't carry out so well. Um,
Unless
I
you're a sociopath.
Yeah, that's true. If you were like, I don't think if you were like playing Among Us like religiously, you would like suddenly start lying a ton. Like maybe you would like maybe think more about lying, but like I don't think I could say for certain that it would necessarily change your mindset. Certainly not a casual game. There is probably some sort of threshold where you kind of think of things in these terms. I also think that a lot of game theorists would say that we engage in a lot of like strategic decisions all the time. So even doing your homework or not, that's a strategic game. Like whether your teacher should check your home should do the work of checking their homework, or whether you should do your homework. And so in that scenario, there's a lot of like potential lying involved in real life, and so they would probably say I don't think they would have as strong qualms against lying, um, just from the game theory standpoint.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's past time, so we should probably like wrap everything up. So this is the end of the first day. No matter how many talks you came to, I hope you had a great time. Uh, Tomorrow we have 3 talks by different professors. In the morning we have Professor Leif Weinar, who's going to be talking about how America pursues oil internationally and how that has led to like a ton of dictatorships and how the law can really change in that regard. Um, Professor Michael Ruse is going to be talking about evolution and how just because like God didn't, just because intelligent design may not be true, how that doesn't like necessarily mean that we shouldn't just like be completely amoral. And then finally, Professor Agnes Callard is going to talk about how we respond, why we respond to certain questions, and just in very neutral, very calm ways, and how in other scenarios they can get us really angry and really emotional. I also think that there's going to be a lot of extra credit that's uh, offered for coming to talks tomorrow. Your teachers should have said that, mentioned that in class, but yeah, I hope you come. It's going to be really awesome. It starts at 10, goes till 3. There's going to be a lunch break. There's more schedule info available.